Before I get to the topic of today's video, I just want to say to the people of China and Taiwan, you're in my thoughts. I am not religious, so I can't say that you're in my prayers, but there's quite a difficult situation transpiring over there with the weather. And so, for those of you who do pray, we should be praying for the people that are unfortunately having to experience such a disaster. But I wanted to use this video today to talk about community online because as I was scrolling through Denpa today, there was quite an interesting post from a few months ago that I felt was very insightful, where one poster was attempting to talk about his or her issues with the internet as it is today, and the fact that seemingly every community-oriented space has been hollowed out in a manner not dissimilar to the hollowing out of communities we have seen in the meat space. And I think there's a variety of reasons for this. I recommend that you read the post itself because it's quite illustrative as well as just being interesting on its own as it pertains to that individual person's experience and likely many others. But I wanted to bring this up because in many respects, the internet has transformed into something that it was not in the past. It has become the meta-meatspace, which is a term that I like quite a lot. That is to say that the internet has become yet another layer of the meat space, or what is sometimes referred to as the real world. If you look, for example, at the fact that on all of the sites where people routinely speak to one another, you tend to see their name, or at the very least you see their face. People interact in a manner that is similar to the real world or mirrors the real world. However, due to the lack of physical presence of the people and the relative anonymity, like even though you can see their face, etc., it is in a relative sense more anonymous because you don't have that physical relationship. Due to this, I think there is less credibility that we lend to online interactions, even though in a functional sense they are the same as real life or quote unquote meat space interactions. And so this creates this bizarre alienating experience where simultaneously you're talking to people that you're aware are real and on some level feel real, but there is not this social responsibility that you might otherwise have in person, both because you can't read people's emotions from like looking at them physically, and also because without physical people present, the instinct to behave in a moral way may not necessarily be there. For me, it continues to be there in the majority of cases, but that's because I'm particularly sensitive to all interactions. Forget about physical ones. It's just all interactions I'm pretty sensitive to. Not to say that I haven't, unfortunately, fell victim to the negative tendencies that we all find ourselves in at some point online. But generally speaking, I and many others online are so sensitive that we continue to humanize people, even in the internet world. And so what I'm saying is not broadly true, but it is to say that there are structural reasons for why some people may be more susceptible to negative or antisocial behavior on the internet than others. There's a really interesting story in Plato's Republic. I forget, it's been so many years since I've read that book now, so I'm trying to remember the exact name of it. It was like the Tale of Aegeus or something like that. But in any case, it's about this guy who discovers a ring that provides invisibility, and ultimately he seduces the king's wife and murders the king, thereby taking over the kingdom. And in Socrates' dialogue about this story, he tries to say that, he tries to treat this story as proof that morals matter regardless of whether or not people are perceiving them. And I think he comes away with somewhat of a different interpretation of the story than Plato, because I think Plato is sort of trying to say, well, without consequences, we don't hold ourselves responsible. And so that's why after he becomes invisible, he ultimately makes these terrible decisions. And so they're, depending on the strand of philosophy that you come from, you're going to come away from that story with different conclusions. But it made a big impression on me when I read it several years ago. And I've continued to think about it ever since, particularly after watching Death Note, which is, I think, a similar, sort of story, because in Death Note, when Kira, or Light, receives this note that fell out of the sky, he's essentially invisible upon utilizing it, because nobody knows. Of course, the investigation unravels over time. I will not spoil what happens in the story, but in the premise of the show, the idea is that you have this book that allows you to kill people while being entirely anonymous. And there are some very interesting ethical questions that arise as a result of that. And as well as just like questions about the nature of humanity, like why would someone do this without fear of consequences? Is it because human morality is innate to what is seen by the other, or is it because some people would happen to act differently under those circumstances? I happen to fall into the camp of more in the line of what Socrates was saying. I think it, more than anything, power reveals. There are situations in which it corrupts as well, but I think more than anything it reveals. And I know this because there have been many instances in which I had the opportunity to do something wrong, and I could have gotten away with it with no consequences. No one would have witnessed me doing said thing. But I didn't do it because there was somebody on the inside telling me, okay, don't do that. That's wrong. This feels wrong. And that Jiminy Cricket on the shoulder, that inner sense of morality, is a guiding force. And I think it indicates who we really are, like morally speaking, more than anything we happen to do in the face of others, anything we happen to do in avoidance of consequences. All of that is to say, I think on the internet, people tend to show their true face. People tend to use the internet as a tool to get out all of the things that they wish they could say to so many people in person. And unfortunately, humanity is filled with a lot of mean, awful people. I think they're overrepresented on the internet because the internet is the perfect playground for those kinds of people. They have absolutely no consequences for their evil behavior, and so they go on here and shit it up for everybody else. I think because the internet is so widely used at this point, in many people's minds, that type of antisocial behavior is just normal, to the point where they have brought it into the real world. And I want to clarify something. When I use the word antisocial in this video, I'm not using it in the sense of like, oh, I don't like to leave my room, or I don't like to talk to people, because I don't like to do those things either for the most part. What I'm referring to is specifically like a pathological type of antisocial, like killing people, or behaviors that demonstrate a consistent and clear lack of empathy. Um, behavior that has a negative impact on society, or behavior that is not pro-social. Pro-social being, kindness and tranquility, you know, being calm around others and affable and these sorts of things. So just clarifying what terms I'm using here. So I think for many people, being antisocial has been normalized, right? And there are a lot of people now that would otherwise be pretty empathetic or kind, that have been kind of molded by this meta-meatspace in which cruelty is doled out regularly. And those people develop a very low self-esteem. They develop these harshly critical tendencies towards themselves, and then they happen to externalize that. They apply it to the rest of the people in the world, and this is very bad. This is very bad on multiple levels, but I think it demonstrates like how malleable people are, right? Because if you're exposed to a society where a certain type of behavior is normalized and you're impressionable, it's very likely that you will replicate those things that are normalized, right? There are some people that, for genetic reasons, or perhaps reasons that are too complex for us to understand, they buck the trend. I always think of that photo in Nazi Germany of everybody raising their hand up to salute Hitler, and then there's just the one guy with his arms crossed. I think more people need to be bringing that type of energy. When I talk about being a fan of individualism, like, that's what I'm talking about. I want to be that guy. And I think in the face of an increasingly negative internet, one that values human dignity and empathy less and less, we all need to be that guy. We all need to be that guy a little bit more, because dehumanization is not the way. Kindness is the way. And again, I'm not advocating for people to become extroverts or something crazy like that. You know me, you'll find me in my room. But when I do interact with people, I don't want to hurt people's feelings. I don't want to make someone's day worse. I would like to make it better if possible. And those are always the people that make an impression on me. The people that I want to remember. Hold on, I have to write something now. Okay, I just received a somewhat concerning message, so I had to make sure all of that was fine and well, and it was. But to go on here, I think about and again, I'm not religious, I'm not Christian, but I think about what Jesus said in John 14:26 and 15:26, when he said that his Father would send the Holy Spirit, who he referred to as the Helper. And one of my idols growing up, Fred Rogers, he had this wonderful quote where he said, "Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping." And I think that's true. Ultimately, if we can focus on those kinds of people, and on being one of those people, we will be able to cut through the tide of negativity and nihilism that is so present on the internet today, the tendency to dehumanize and to hurt others. And I'm not saying this to be self-aggrandizing or to, make myself sound like this grand moral agent. No, I'm not that. But I would like to be that. And that's the goal. The goal is to be someone better than who you are currently. And unfortunately, that kind of spirit is not present on the internet. But if that kind of spirit is not present on the internet, how can there be a sense of community, right? How can there be people coming together if people in general online don't even believe in recognizing our shared humanity, the things that make us more similar than different? And I think that always has to be the starting point, because ultimately, regardless of what you believe, you are a person. And what I tend to look for is not, what someone believes or what they think, but rather the intentions that they have in coming to that conclusion. What are their axioms? Good people can think terrible things, right? And that's just one example of the differences that we may have. But in a broad sense, our values are perhaps the same. The fact that we're both human is the same. And if we can focus more on that, and to try and find the helpers to be them ourselves, I think we have a chance. But it's difficult, right? It's difficult to foster this sense of community, this sense of recognition, of all of us, and this is even though I gave some tacit praise or advocacy for the idea of individualism earlier in this video, which is something I stand by. I also think that it's undeniable that humans are a product of the broader collective, right? If I were a doctor, for example, the thing that would make me a doctor is not the fact that I would be able to practice medicine. It would be the fact that you recognize me as such, or rather, the fact that you come to my office and seek out care. That would be the thing that makes me a doctor. So the idea of what you are is you can't sever that from what other people recognize you as. And this is fundamental, right? This is also what Evangelion is about. Evangelion is about coming to terms with the identity, the image of you that exists in the mind of someone else. And trying to figure out how that fits into your conception of yourself and the struggle therein. It's really fundamental stuff. All of this is. And I feel like it's all fundamental to the internet and the lack of community that we have here, the alienation that so many people are experiencing, because right now the internet, it's not an individualist place, it's not a collectivist place, it's not a community. It's a hyper individualist place in which the people are extremely subjugated, extremely alienated from one another. And so everything sort of becomes about your individual clout, your individual wealth, the your individual beauty, or at least the way that it's perceived, through a series of filters and such. It's about epically owning people and all these things. And what you get is, many situations similar to ones I've observed my father in, back when he used to have a more serious drug problem. I remember going to these rooms and seeing him surrounded by people who were using these drugs, and it all sort of felt like they were in their own little bubble, right? There wasn't, sort of this. It wasn't even like they were having a conversation with one another or recognizing one another, um, as as people. It just sort of felt like they were in these individual bubbles, um, and it felt profoundly lonely to look at these people, quote unquote, interact with one another. It didn't feel like an interaction. It just felt like they were all in their own little alienated circle, surrounded by one another, but completely alone at the same time. And I feel like the internet is like that. I feel like there are servers that people are in, and sure, they're talking to each other, but they're not saying anything to one another. They're not having an interaction, or rather, they're saying things to one another, but they're not talking to one another. Um, is the actual order that I intended to say that in. And it's extremely sad. Like, it just feels really lonely. Um, and I think it's because of this atomization that we've experienced where, we're not part of this broader community. We're not recognizing one another as humans and as part of the same thing. We're just sort of off doing our own little thing. And I don't know, it's hard to describe. I'm trying to describe it right now, but it's extremely difficult. I haven't fully worked out the theory. I'm sure somebody who's better at philosophy and thinking about this sort of stuff can elucidate it in the comments for me, or give a better approximation of what I'm trying to say. But ultimately, it's a very difficult thing to work through, and I don't have all of the solutions. I think it's a combination of things, right? It's the fact that the medium of communication of the internet doesn't necessarily lend itself to humanization and to really genuine interaction, although it is possible to have that on here for sure. And it's also because of the kind of society that we live in right now. I said this at the start of the video, that the internet has become meta-meatspace, and what's going on in meta-meatspace, or in the meat space? Nobody has any community anymore. And nobody has any community because people are working overtime for pay that doesn't cover the cost of their health insurance, their housing, their food. People are indebting themselves to get a degree just to work at a job where you spend the rest of your life paying off the debt that it took to get that degree. Not to mention car payments, home payments if you happen to be lucky enough to afford a home, which you most likely won't be. And all of this has created a world where people have to be working constantly. They have very little time for their friends, their family, for themselves. And what happens to people in a society where you're working all the time and the little time that you have is recovery time? Well, you start consuming. You see an increase in the consumption of drugs, an increase in the consumption of basically slop, like media that provides quick gratification but doesn't really have any substance. And there's a reason for that. It's because when you take people and essentially force them to be in survival mode. And you indebt them to the system, essentially trapping them into this cycle of constant work. Not only do they have very little time for community and connection, they don't have any energy for it. And so we have become profoundly isolated as a species. Um, this atomization is becoming every time more uh, concerning. And yeah, I don't know. It's that's basically what I think happened. I think the internet, the lack of community online, is it mirrors the lack of community in person. And if we want to facilitate a more humane and open internet, we must first focus on developing a more open and humane society, one where community and a sense of shared humanity is at the forefront. And the only way we can achieve that is by increasing the social welfare, increasing a sense of purpose and meaning for people in their work, but also reducing the overall amount of time that they work, creating a society in which all the basics are covered and people don't have to worry about the things that they need just to get by. And and so the simple but at the same time very complex answer to this is we need to make a less alienated society if we ever hope to develop a robust sense of community again. With that being said, there are people who are fighting back. There are people who are working together to share the costs of their housing, or to grow their own food and to live together. And this is a wonderful thing, but there needs to be a lot more done. And, at the end of the day, there are communities online. They're just very small, but they tend to be made up of those kinds of people. The kinds of people who are, sharing their housing, who don't have to work 24/7, who might be growing their own food. Among, these helpers in many cases, readers as well, people who are able to describe the kinds of things I'm trying to describe much better than me. They've managed to forge their own community in spite of this deeply atomized and alienated society we find ourselves in. So needless to say, I thought it was a very interesting post on Denpa-chan. I thought it generated some interesting discussion as well, but this is my take on said post.